we're part of the same energy system and network, so it's great to collaborate with you folks on what you're doing down there. So I'm going to quickly go over and provide a little background to the Commission, where it came from, what the major functions are that it serves, and then Amy is going to go into more detail on how the Commission is actually structured, how the working groups work, and what some of the results of our work have been. And then we'll end with some reflections on what the conditions are that are really needed to have this kind of initiative happen in your municipality or your state. So the Commission evolved out of an appreciation of the fact that success on the city's climate action plan was going to require action by virtually all of the segments in the city. The city has a climate action plan that's pretty similar to other large cities in the United States of America. It has a adaptation focus and a mitigation focus. The mitigation focus has a short-term goal of a 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020 and an 80% reduction by the year 2050. And as noted on the slide, the municipal operations in the city are 2% or less of the city's total GHG emissions load. So hitting those targets on a community-wide basis, and they're community-wide targets, not municipal government targets, is going to require engagement of a really broad set of stakeholders, and most of the capital and investment for that is going to come out of the private and the institutional sector. On the adaptation side, we're a coastal city, and we're looking at something in the in the region of 5 to 6 feet of sea level rise by 2100. And in the current design of Boston's urban form, we'll lose about 30% of the city at least once a year to floods if we don't change the design of the city. So we're going to have to fundamentally remake our urban form over the next 8 decades. And again, that is not something that can be done by city government alone without the deep engagement of stakeholders. So the Commission came out of 2 parallel events that were happening. One was the city's implementation and updating of its climate action plan in 2010, where they really put in place their first really detailed climate action plan. And at the same time, the local Barr Foundation, which is a large privately held foundation here in Boston, made the decision to move virtually all of their environmental grant making into the domain of place-based climate action, and they made a commitment to invest $50 million over 5 years, $10 million a year in a combination of Boston, New England, and some broader grant making. And as part of the research for that and as part of the city's development of its climate plan, the question kept coming up, where is the business and civic leadership table where we go have these difficult and hard and long-term dialogue about the choices facing the city on both the mitigation and the adaptation front? And there wasn't an existing entity that was really well served to put that together. So that's what really led to the creation of the Commission. The members of the Commission were invited to participate by both former Mayor Menino and Amos Hostetter, who's one of the co-founders of the Barr Foundation and is now a co-chair of the Commission. So the Commission plays a couple of different roles. One, we provide advice to the city on the design of its climate action plan, and particularly, again, there with a focus on what's called the large C&I sector, the commercial industrial sector. So we provide feedback through working groups, through meetings, through dialogue with city staff on the design of the plan and the strategies for implementing the plan. I would say the majority of our work is in the second bullet of this slide, which is advocating within the key sectors to align the work of those sectors with the targets in the city climate action plan. And then last, we spent a lot of time highlighting best practice from across the city, providing examples in particular of large institutions and organizations that have implemented and hit and exceeded the kinds of targets that are in the city's climate action plan. Boston University, as an example, set a target of a 25% reduction by 2020, and they just hit that target last year in 2014. So those kinds of examples are examples that prove that the kinds of targets that are in the city's climate action plan are not crazy targets, but they're doable. This slide shows a highlight of the types of folks who are on the commission. We currently have 34 members. We have good representation from higher education, from the healthcare sector, from commercial real estate, hospitality, finance, and insurance. We recently added a new member on construction. Both of our major utilities, the electric utility, Eversource, and our gas utility, National Grid, participate on the commission. We have members of the clean energy sector. We have representatives from 5 foundations. We have the Secretary of the Commonwealth on Energy and Environment, Matt Beaton, participates. So we've got some faith-based organizations, local NGOs, and some international NGOs. And I'm assuming that Carrie will make this slideshow available to all the participants. And the last slide on the slideshow is a list of the actual members themselves. So part of our challenge, as this next slide asks, is, so what's in it for these CEOs? These are really, really busy people. They run, in many instances, very large organizations. How do we convince them to take the time out of their schedule and commit their personal energy to this kind of work? And we found out, I think, a couple of leverage points here, so to speak. One is a number of these folks really just have a personal passion about this. They get it. They've seen the consequences of climate change. They've seen the benefit of mitigation for their own business strategy, and they're civic-minded, and they really want the city to succeed at this. I think second, it's very useful and valuable for them to engage with the mayor and with other leaders in the city. So in many ways, the commission meetings become a really good networking opportunities for a lot of the CEOs in the network. Third, increasingly there's very, very close alignment with the goals in the climate action plan and the institutional strategies that the members of the commission are pursuing. So they get a lot of value out of learning best practices and enhancing their own game. A great example of this is Boston Properties, who's one of the members of the commission. They control about 12 million square feet in the city of Boston, including the Prudential Center and the John Hancock Building. And they're participating on the commission along with the president of Boston University, Dr. Robert Brown. And it turned out that when they sat down and had a conversation with each other, they discovered between the two of them, they own the majority of the commercial property in the Back Bay, which is an area that's quite susceptible to sea level rise. And so they ended up actually setting up a set of meetings between the sustainability team at BU and the sustainability team at Boston Property to share their learning with each other and advance each other's strategy, which really gets to the last point, is networking with peers and learning best practices from each other has been really, really valuable to them. So the question, and then what's in it for the city? Why would they take the time to do this? And I think this has been incredibly valuable for former Mayor Menino and the current Mayor Walsh, because it gives them a cohort of highly informed leaders that they can interact with, bounce ideas off of, test out controversial potential strategies before they actually launch them, and allows them to really keep their pulse on what the large institutional and private sector players are thinking about. And last but not least, it provides a vehicle for some continuity across administrations during the tenure of the Green Ribbon Commission, which was launched in 2010. So we just had our 5th-year anniversary. We've had one mayoral transition and one gubernatorial transition, and in both of those instances, members of the Green Ribbon Commission met with the candidates during the election, articulated, why they cared about climate issues, and articulated what their priorities were for policy for the new administration. And then they met with both the newly elected governor and the newly elected mayor to reinforce that. So as a way of creating a stakeholder base that provides some continuity across political administrations, because as we all know, this work is measured in decades, not years. So you've got to have some reservoir of political will that is willing to focus on the long term. You can't do something like the Green Ribbon Commission if you don't have some resources to pay for the staff support, to pay for the working groups, to pay for the meetings, really to run a budget for it. And the Green Ribbon Commission is funded by a coalition of 6 funders. The Barr Foundation is the lead foundation, but we also get resources from the local community foundation, the Boston Foundation, and several other foundations. Typically, their commitments are multi-year, 3-year commitments that commit funding over an extended period of time. As I indicated earlier, we really are focused on the large commercial industrial component in the city. The commission is not really representative of neighborhood and community-based organizations. It wasn't really designed that way, and there are other vehicles that the city uses to engage with those stakeholders. We actually conducted some analysis that I think is useful to walk through here. In Boston, a little over half, it says 50%, I think actually in the last greenhouse gas inventory it was 52%, of the city-wide emissions come out of the commercial and industrial sector. And the research that we did, which took a fair amount of time and a lot of digging through assessor databases and other sources of information, tried to identify who were the largest property owners in the city. Turns out the top 50 property owners control about 60% of the non-residential square footage in the city. So if you think 60% of the 50%, that gives you about 30%. So those 50 property owners account for about 30% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the city. It's probably higher than 30% because it's very likely that those large players that include higher education and healthcare, et cetera, have way higher energy use intensities than the smaller players. So I think it's probably realistic to think that those 50 players probably control something in the order of 40% of the total greenhouse gas emissions of the city. So, so our goal is to get those property owners to take the city's targets, both at short-term and at long-term targets, and internalize them into their strategic planning, their CapEx budget planning, their energy master plans, and other internal documents so that they are aligned with their business strategy. And so, because if we don't, if these players don't internalize those goals and make those goals their own goals, then there's no way the city is going to be able to hit its long-term targets. So the next slide is a picture of the structure of the commission, kind of how it works. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Amy Longsworth, who's the staff director here in Boston for the commission, and let her talk a little bit about how the commission is structured, what kind of working groups we have, and how those working groups do their work. Amy?
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. As John mentioned, the Green Ribbon Commission has about 34 members on it now, and they come together twice a year, and they're also involved in specific working groups as chair people of the working groups. However, most of the actual content over the course of the year, the content work, gets performed within the context of the staff level working groups. So we've got essentially two types of working groups, and there's even a third piece here that isn't represented on the slide that we call cross-cutting initiatives, and those are things that don't fall squarely into either sector working groups or issue working groups. But on the sector working group, we have a group of healthcare organizations, a group of higher educational institutions, and a group of commercial real estate and hospitality businesses that are loosely affiliated, are pleased to be coming together under the banner or the brand of the Green Ribbon Commission as a working group, and each of them has an NGO that particularly leads that working group. So, for example, the Higher Education Working Group consists of 5 leading institutions. There are about 10 others. You know, here in Boston we have no dearth of educational institutions, and so there are probably about 15 altogether who are either strongly or loosely affiliated with this working group. And it's run by the folks out of the Harvard University Office of Sustainability. They receive I would say, you know, reasonably modest budget every year to produce certain deliverables, which are within, those deliverables are defined within the overall strategic goals of the city's climate action plan and the Green Ribbons goals, but they're really arrived at specifically by discussion within the working group. So, for example, the Higher Education Working Group this year will produce they're doing a conference, and they're doing data collection and really digging in deep into the topic of energy intensity in labs and what can be done to mitigate energy usage in labs. It's called the Green Labs Initiative. So in this case, they're actually working with the healthcare group because both hospitals and research universities have the same issue of energy usage in labs. And when the city decided to institute an ordinance that required all buildings of energy use over a certain size to start reporting, one of the real challenges for any institution that had a lab was that the lab wasn't specifically called out as a different kind of use. Therefore, they were concerned about how their data would be presented. So this has been a matter of discussion back and forth between both of those working groups and their institutions and the city. And I think the Green Ribbon Commission's role has been to be a place where that conversation can take place and serve as a brand under which that conversation can take place. So healthcare is hospitals, higher education, commercial real estate and hospitality. We have a lot of hotels as well as the big commercial buildings, and each of those, the work of each of those groups is run by an NGO. In the case of healthcare, it's Healthcare Without Harm, and in the case of commercial real estate, it's a group here called, it's a trade association that's very focused on transportation as well as building efficiency and sustainability, called ABC, A Better City. So each of those is, you know, running that group over on. Then we have a different kind of working group, which is a little bit more issue-focused rather than infrastructure-focused. Transportation is a group that is actually no longer active, although it may be reactivated. Worked with the city to look at what needed to be done in the transportation sector and actually made a transfer of the work over to a city group because the city wanted to involve much more stakeholder engagement processes in that work. Climate preparedness is a working group that is very active at the moment. The Green Ribbon Commission was able to, aside from our normal round of funding, identify about approximately another $1 million, some of which came from the state, to look at what, to focus on what is going, to build consensus, let me put it that way, around the many pieces of analysis that have already been done about what climate change will bring to Boston over the next 50 or 100 years, to try to get some kind of consensus range around that so that we're not spending all of our precious time here debating whether it's 6 feet or 8.5 feet, but getting a general sense of what's that going to look like, and then developing policy options, physical infrastructure related or solution options, and general consensus around how we can address and adapt climate change as one of our main thrusts. And at the same time, of course, we'll be focusing on mitigation, which is going to be our next big working group that will be added to the list. That's probably going to go into the other slot. The full complement of the Green Ribbon Commission meets only twice a year. So as you can see, there's a lot of work that goes on in the interim. And I'll just quickly describe one of these meetings. So there are about 34 members, probably on a, we don't get everyone every time, but we get a very strong complement of members who are sitting in a large U shape. And then the people who are involved in the working groups, the staff, and often the staff of the people who are actually the commissioners, their staff from their institutions or their businesses will also be in the room. So we're sitting with about, somewhere between 50 to 75 people, hearing from presenters, hearing from the mayor, hearing from each other, getting reports on what has the work that's been done in the interim, and thinking ahead about what this really means physically, politically, technically, socially for the future of Boston. It's a really exciting environment, I would say. And at the last meeting, which was about a month ago, we were very fortunate to have John Holdren, who's the White House science advisor. He has a longer title than that, but that's essentially who he is, come and give the assembled group the latest on climate science, what we know, what we believe, and what the impacts are going to be. And I will say Boston's Mayor Walsh sat, we all did, but particularly I think it was affecting for him to hear firsthand from someone at that level what that was going to mean for the city, probably well beyond his tenure, but understanding that we have to take actions now. And it was a moment that I don't think could have been created anywhere other than in that room with that particular set of people. What else can I say about the working group? We do other events, other cross-cutting initiatives. So under the brand, and really this is a lot about creating a brand, there are also a number of other things going on that don't fall squarely into one or another of the working groups. We have sponsored, or I should say the Barr Foundation has sponsored, but the Green Ribbon Commission has branded and managed a renewable energy prize, for example, where we challenged any institution or nonprofit-led coalition in eastern Massachusetts to develop at least 10 megawatts of renewable energy, new megawatts, and vie for a $100,000 prize that was put on the table to cover soft costs. In fact, today is the deadline, so it's a very exciting day for us to see what they've come up with. We think we have 3 strong submissions. We do a series of conferences on climate finance. Recently in September, and actually the commissioner from Connecticut attended, so thank you for loaning her to us for the day. We had a large discussion about the role of insurance and commercial real estate. Why, exploring the question of why more resilience investments were not sort of better reflected in insurance rates. And that was a really interesting discussion and opened up a can of worms. I'm not sure we understood that we were opening when we first asked the question, but that's the kind of exploration that the Green Ribbon Commission can do. Really quickly, so I think I've covered a lot of this, but the organization is 2 co-chairs, Amos Hostetter, the head of the Barr Foundation, and Mayor Walsh. A number of members represented just by the 6 boxes here. managing organization would be, for a working group here, would be a group like Harvard University, and then the member organizations would be the universities underneath it. So this would represent a single working group. The co-chairs for the higher ed working group are actually Katie Lapp of Harvard and Israel Ruiz of MIT. And the typical work that they do, and it's a fairly fluid discussion, I would say, between me and John and other members of the GRC, and what the working group themselves feel that their agenda ought to be, but they will do things like conduct research into their sector to produce good data that would be difficult for anyone other than themselves to access. They work on topical reports. Harvard is working on one now on additionality and how to communicate and talk about in a compelling yet honest way about green energy. They share best practices. There's a lot of that goes along. They follow legislation and share it with each other to the extent that it affects the different working groups. So there's a lot of opportunity for creativity, which I think is another piece that the Green Ribbon Commission brings to the table.
Great. So we're going to end with just a quick overview of some of the initiatives that we have sponsored. Amy talked a little bit about the work we did on the climate adaptation side. We agreed to partner with the city on launching an initiative to really jumpstart the city's long-term climate preparedness action. We raised $650,000 from the private sector. They matched it with a $350,000 state grant, and we have organized the CEO stakeholders to provide input into that process. That process will now get us an agreed upon climate forecast. It will get us an integrated vulnerability assessment, and it will get us a list of resiliency initiatives for the city to be working on, including an infrastructure advisory group to bring together the key infrastructure players around the kind of investments they need to make for long-term resilience. And again, our role was to identify the issue, and there were a couple of, it actually came out of a few of the commercial real estate players on the commission who have fairly substantial property holdings in New York and who went through the Sandy experience, and they came back from New York and said, Sandy hasn't hit us here yet, but we need to get our act in gear. We need to take a leadership role on this, and that's really what led into that. A similar kind of experience on transportation. The commission hosted a one-day kind of dialogue session on the role of transportation in greenhouse gas emissions, and the question kept coming up, where is the long-term vision for the city of Boston in terms of what the new mobility system will look like? And people basically said, our problem is we're fighting problems with the MBTA and with other sort of components of our system, but we really don't have a long-term plan. And really the last time a long-term plan was done for the city of Boston was 40 years ago. And so out of that process, the city agreed to launch a long-term mobility planning process called Go Boston 2030. And our transportation working group worked with the city to really design the specifications for that, which ended up being issued as an RFP, and they've hired a contractor, and they're now in the middle of that process. So again, we identified the issue, we framed it in the context of the climate action plan, we helped raise some resources, and we handed it off to the city for implementation. In the buildings area, we've been working with a lot of the different owners on their own building energy efficiency implementation, but we have also organized our working groups to provide input to the state-level Energy Efficiency Advisory Council that controls the $700-odd million a year of ratepayer money that go into energy efficiency incentives to provide input to them, particularly around the implementation in the large C&I sector. as Amy indicated, we put together a renewable energy purchasing network that led to the creation of the Renewable Energy Leadership Prize, and out of that process ended up creating a set of reports on how electricity prices get done in the New England region and what factors influence it. And that is now leading into a partnership with Advanced Energy Economy on the 21st century utility design, which we did another co-convening with them on 2 weeks ago, which again, we were very pleased. The commissioner from Connecticut and Rhode Island were both there, and we're now starting to talk about how do we engineer and design the rate structure in ISO New England so that it really incentivizes renewables and district generation. Lastly, the new area that we're starting to work on that will probably take an approach pretty similar to what we did on climate adaptation is the 80 by 50 targets. This is hitting the 80% reduction by 2050. And in that case, it required a lot of action at the state level. The city of Boston cannot hit those targets in electricity, transportation, buildings, and waste without a partnership with the state. So we are in the process of doing a design, raising funding, and starting a process similar to what we did with climate preparedness to really jumpstart the long-term deep decarbonization strategy for the city. So that gives you a little overview on where the Green Ribbon Commission came from, how it's structured, and some of the things we have been doing. You have our contact information here at the end. Feel free to connect with us if you have additional questions. And the last slide is an attachment that shows the overall commission membership. And so, Carrie, I think now we'll move into the question and answer period.
Yes, great. Thank you. That was extremely informative. So yeah, we have a few questions, and folks on the line, if you have questions that you would like to be answered, please submit them in the question and answer box, and I'll read them aloud for John and Amy to respond to. So just a few questions here to start with. You mentioned some of the data in the early parts of the slides, and 50 property owners consist of 30% of the total emissions of the city. How did you collect the data on property owners' emissions?
So just to be clear, that's an extrapolation out of square footage. The analysis we did was what the total non-residential square footage controlled by those property owners, and that we got out of a integrated, we had to go through the assessor database and in essence figure out which buildings were owned by which people to aggregate them up into their ownership structure. But we did not do a separate greenhouse gas emissions inventory by those buildings. The city of Boston did pass 2 years ago a building energy reporting and disclosure ordinance, affectionately referred to as BERDO, and that does mandate, similar to the way reporting ordinances are in other cities, it mandates that properties initially larger than 50,000 square feet and eventually down to 25,000 square feet have to report their energy usage on an annual basis in EPA's portfolio manager, and then the city rolls that data up and is able to give us a snapshot of the energy use. I would though mention that as an example, one of the projects that the healthcare working group did is they got 20 hospitals to voluntarily agree to do a roll-up of their energy data in Portfolio Manager a year in advance of the passage of the BERDO ordinance, and they also were able to do it in a way that really, represented more of the fine-grained differentiation of building types that you typically see in the institutional sector. And so they now have an ongoing database, actually I think it's on a quarterly basis, not an annual basis, of energy use in the healthcare sector, and can use that to sort of track the sector's progress against the city targets. But specific to those 50 property owners, we did not do a separate GHG emissions inventory for those buildings. It was just based on square footage.
Okay, great.
But now the good thing is with the BERDO ordinance, now that we have that data, now we can actually go back and map those owners to the buildings that got reported in Burdo and aggregate them up by ownership so we can go to the owners and sort of taking a portfolio approach rather than a building by building approach.
Sure. And with the healthcare facilities, they did it voluntarily. What type of do you know what type of assistance they got, and what was the rationale for, or what was their rationale for going ahead and doing it on their own?
So that's a good question, and it wasn't an easy process. So the process again was staffed by Healthcare Without Harm, who staffs the healthcare working group. And for those of you familiar with Healthcare Without Harm, they are the international NGO that's really been driving the climate issue in the healthcare community and the healthcare industry. So they work with lots of healthcare systems across the country, so we're very familiar with what it took to, to get the data and to roll it up. I think for the facilities, it's similar to any kind of benchmarking process. For the individual facility managers, it allows them to benchmark their activities against others and gives them a way of tracking their progress.
We also have a concentrated ownership of some of those hospitals in Partners Healthcare, which owns a large majority of the hospitals here.
Yeah, they have Partners is the largest employer in the state of Massachusetts, actually, and they own 12 hospitals. Okay. And they have a very aggressive climate and energy strategy. Actually is quite a bit ahead of the city targets, and so that was, that helped us a lot with kind of getting the buy-in. But I think like all these things, it's down to hand-to-hand combat. You got to go facility manager by facility manager and make the case, and then help them do it easier. And now, kind of partway through that process, there was a pretty good sense that the Burdo ordinance was going to be coming down the pike, so not bad for these folks to sort of get in and figure this out in advance of the requirements of the ordinance. But I think it just had a lot to do with the relationship that Healthcare Without Harm had with these players that allowed them to convince them to do it.
Great. Okay. What issue has been the toughest to tackle? Like transportation, buildings, anything else that has been a really tough nut to crack?
Yeah, I would say that here in Boston, I would say transportation is probably the most problematic climate strategy from our point of view, and it's problematic from a number of fronts. One, the system, and Boston is a little unusual in this, but I think that, I think all metro centers face the same kind of problem. The control of the transportation system is just incredibly fragmented. You've got the city itself that has a transportation department, but it actually controls a very small amount of the actual flow of transportation. We've got the MBTA that controls the subway, the T, and the bus system. You've got the state that controls, a lot of the highways. They did a little, actually this was one of the workshop that kind of led to the Go Boston 2030, process. Stephanie Pollock, who's now the Commissioner of Transportation for Governor Baker, gave an example of an interchange in Boston where they wanted to change the configuration of one of the exit ramps. There were 9 separate agencies that had to sign off on the engineering design. So the fragmentation level is very high. I think the nature of the technical solutions that can lead you to decarbonization are more complex and more multifaceted than in the electricity domain, and there isn't yet really a clear vision about what an integrated urban mobility system that can get us clean, low emissions, affordable, convenient and user-friendly service looks like. There's enormous technological change happening with a lot of different kind of providers. So there just isn't in that domain, again, I think in contrast to the building domain and the emerging vision of 21st century utilities in the electricity supply domain, zero waste in the waste domain, there isn't clarity about what the end vision looks like that allows you to corral that multiple complicated set of players together. So I would say that's the most challenging area we're working on.
And can I just add, there's almost a mood about that sector. There's sort of big dig hangover.
Yes.
And there's Olympics hangover.
Yes.
And there's MBTA, you know, hangover from last winter, it's lack of functioning, and I almost feel like it's, you know, even if it weren't already technically harder, it would be politically harder.
Yeah, we are the home of the, you know, $14 billion, most expensive infrastructure project in the history of the United States of America that took 25 years to accomplish and cost $22 billion. So
and it's below sea level.
And it involved putting a large tunnel below sea level. And then we got 100+ inches of snow last year, and I'm sure you saw the news reports as well as everybody else. The T basically shut down, and the T, by the way, is heavily burdened by debt from the big dig. So it's a complicated arena technically in terms of what the solutions are. It's a complicated arena in terms of the level of control that the city actually has over it, and it's a complicated issue because of the, you know, fractious politics around it. So I'd say that's the biggest challenge area.
I think we're probably facing a similar challenge with transportation. And I think you make a great point of, you know, the compounding effects of, you know, potentially climate change on the transportation you know, flow of vehicles and mass transit, et cetera, something to think about.
Yeah, so there's a big, you know, there's a big push here in Boston to start thinking about, you know, bus rapid transit, BRT. You know, again, you know, when you're looking at the kind of flood scenarios we're looking at, anything that's above ground is going to be better than something that's below ground. So I just think that's an area. I think people have clarity. I think we're starting to get clarity on the, you know, renewable energy vision for electricity supply. I think we're getting clarity on the, how we can drive down consumption in buildings and what the economic case, you know, for that is. I think the zero waste, you know, vision is getting more clear. I just don't think there's clarity yet on the sustainable transportation vision yet. So if you guys figure that out, call us up and help us out.
Well, hopefully we can tackle it as a region. A couple more questions. Do you have any type of recognition program?
We don't, but the City of Boston does. So there are two important, I think, things going on around it. There is a thing called the Carbon Cup that is given out by the mayor to large emitters who make a commitment for a particular kind of reduction in over 1 million square feet of space. And so usually each year there are 2 to 3 carbon cups that...
It's a 35% reduction by 2020 rather.
35% by 2020 in at least 1 million square feet of space. So it doesn't have to be all of your space, but it has to be a minimum of 1 million square feet. And then the organization that Amy mentioned that staffs our commercial real estate working group, A Better City, who, by the way, used to be called the Arterial Business Committee, and they were the organization that represented the interests of the downtown businesses during the Big Dig. So they have strong transportation genetics. But they run something called the Challenge for Sustainability, which is more like an office challenge kind of, or Architecture 2030 district kind of thing. And I think now they have they have owners and tenants that represent 40 million square feet of space enrolled in the Challenge for Sustainability. So I think those are probably the two primary recognition kind of things.
Okay, and the last question that I have, unless others want to submit another question, but do you think your model could be adapted to a state planning process? So obviously here in Connecticut, we do have some municipal planning happening, but we don't have a city the size of Boston. But we're focusing as a state wholly. I liked your structure. I'm wondering if that could be, in your opinion, if that could be adapted to state planning process.
I think it would require some tweaks because a big attraction for the CEOs is that they're deeply connected to the city of Boston. They care about the city of Boston. They have assets here and they have businesses here, et cetera. So you'd have to kind of figure out how you got that sense of identity and ownership. But I actually think in states like Connecticut that don't have, large urban, centers or slightly more dispersed, I think actually a statewide model of this is better than a city-based model. And again, this assumes that there's a state climate plan. The commission, and by the way, I guess I didn't mention this at the front end, the commission does not have its own legal entity. It's a totally voluntary CEO network, so it's not its own NGO. It's not its own, it's not its own entity. But it needs a client. So our client is the city of Boston. And the implementation of the City of Boston's Climate Action Plan. So if a state has a climate plan and that it is trying to implement, then there would be a clear customer for a commission like this. But it has to have a customer that it's enabling on behalf of, because we're not running our own game. We're here to help the city implement its climate action plan. But yeah, I think in a place like Connecticut, a state model wouldn't be a bad thing to look at all. And
can I just add, I'll even do a little plug for your book, John. But John and his and a co-author, Pete Plastrick, wrote a book about networking and networking to solve large problems like climate change. And my observation, having come into this, about a year ago, so not as steeped in it as John, but maybe with the advantage of an outside observer, I would say it's the commitment to giving up a command and control structure that I think has been a large reason that the Green Ribbon Commission has worked. It's the idea that to solve a problem as complex and as ever-changing as climate change is, you need to be a flexible and constantly learning organization. And so being able to structure something that can ride that balance between actually getting things done but not forcing anything, and being willing to change course if something isn't working, being able to give the leadership to different parts of the organization as you go along. Those are things that are much softer elements, but I think also really critical to success.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction, Carrie, is, if we were some kind of formal authority or commission that had some kind of formal appointment process where the mayor appointed members and we got into the business of representing interests as opposed to being individuals who have a passion about that, it would change the whole character of it. The informal, voluntary nature of the network is really what allows it to be flexible and entrepreneurial and innovative. And if it turned into yet another, and actually I wouldn't call it a commission if I was going to do it again, because the name gives it the wrong impression, because we have no authority of any kind whatsoever. If you turn it into sort of a formal representation thing, it loses some of its juice. And so I think if you do think about that, I would be careful about that balance. It's really got to be individuals, not entities that are represented on the commission, and they have to have a personal passion about it, and it's got to stay flexible and non-bureaucratic.
Great. I think those are a lot of really good tips. So that's all the questions that we have on our end. Unless you have any other notes that you want to pass on. want to thank you for your time and your presentation. And yes, we will post the presentation on our website as well as the recording of the webinar for folks to view. Their contact information is on there if you'd like to reach out to them directly. But I hope to stay in touch and share best practices as we move forward on our climate strategy.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much. Everyone have a great day.
Okay,
right,
bye.
Bye.